discussing, and that is going to be changes to the Supreme Court that are made, encouraged by our Supreme to society by our Supreme Court. The Supreme Court and its Chief Justice Earl Warren are really going to push to make sure that everyone has access to the same rights. And Kennedy will support this kind of behavior by the Supreme Court to help change society. So let me give you an example of some of the things our Supreme Court did. In our country, one of the things that we had is, you see it right up here, the Constitution protects Americans against unfair government's actions and laws. That's the goal of the Constitution. But, for the longest time, what this meant was only what you see right here, highlighted. That the national government in Washington, D.C. couldn't treat you unfairly. States had different rules for everybody. Some states would do one thing, some states would do another. Well, what about a lawyer? Do I get access to a lawyer? In some states you did. In some states you didn't. What about freedom of speech? In some states that was restricted. In some states it wasn't. Search warrant protection. Some states you got it, some states you didn't. The Supreme Court is going to turn to something. It's going to turn to the 14th Amendment. And in the 14th Amendment is a statement about what you can see called here on this slide, due process of law. Due process of law is the idea that everyone should be treated fairly under the law before punished, regardless of where you live in our country. So, they pass a series of court cases that say no state shall deprive you of life, liberty, or property without treating you fairly. So what happens is now due process in our country includes three things. It's not just the Constitution making sure the government acts fairly and you're protected. It's understanding that it means the national government and state and local governments. They all have to treat you fairly before you can be punished. I'll give you several court cases that help you kind of understand that. One of them is Miranda v. Arizona. In Arizona, there wasn't protection for you if you were questioned by the police. So, for example, Ernesto Miranda signs a confession. He wasn't notified properly that anything he could say could be used against him in a court of law. So he's coerced into, he agrees to sign a confession. He didn't realize he didn't have to. He ends up going to jail. He sues. And the Supreme Court says you have the right to remain silent, not just in federal court, but you have the right to remain silent in state and local courts as well, as long as you're an adult. So there's an example of how that expands. Here's another one. It's called Reynolds v. Sims, and it changes the way we vote and count our votes. States used to be able to set up the system for voting however they wanted. So what I've done here is I've used Pennsylvania as an example. You could say that Pennsylvania could be divided up into however many districts, and each district would elect a person to Congress. So in this case, what do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 districts, and each one could elect a person to Congress. And, you know, there's differing populations in each region of Pennsylvania, right? Like Philly, Pittsburgh, they got a ton of people. Wilkes-Barre, Erie, got a lot of people. Harrisburg, you know, it's got some, not as much. This area of Pennsylvania, not a lot of people at all, right? Just kind of rural area. But each of them gets to elect a person. The Constitution says we can get 8 different seats in Congress, so we get to elect 8 people, and this way, the amount of land that each person governs is the same. But this is unfair. Think about it. If we pretend that this person is just one person. So one person lives in this whole area. When that one person elects somebody to represent them, that person gets their own essential vote in Congress. One vote in Congress for one person. Here, Erie, 6 people in Erie get only one vote in Congress. Well, if this guy is one and he gets a vote, why don't they get 6 votes? How is it that this guy, these 2 guys, there's 3 guys, each of these get a vote in Congress, but all of these people that live in Pittsburgh, they only get 1 vote in Congress? This guy that lives in Philly only gets 1 vote in Congress? He gets the same representation as everybody who lives in the middle of nowhere? How is that even fair? So they look at this and they say, man, this really isn't fair at all. But let me give you a hint as to why they did this. Because in urban areas, you had an increasing number of ethnic minorities, which, for the sake of this argument, I'm highlighting green. And in the rural areas, the red squares, you had a lot of white people. Well, now look at this. We have so many ethnic minorities in these regions, but they get the same power in Congress, 1 vote, as just these few white people. How about that? So the Supreme Court hears an argument called Reynolds v. Sims, and they want to change the way we count votes using something called reapportionment. And it says that states can't draw up districts in a way that makes it unfair. Most Americans live in urban districts, but most states didn't reflect that. So a lot of ethnic minorities get their just 1 representation. It means that fewer white people get the same amount of representatives. This isn't fair. So Reynolds v. Sims says that each district has to have about the same population, not land. This should make everyone's influence more of the same. It's an idea called 1 man, 1 vote. Here is what that looks like. 1 man, 1 vote says everyone's votes have equal weight. Look here. This light blue area, that's 1 district. This little green one, that's a district. This red one, district, district, district. This gigantic one, district. There's but as many people in here, the same number of people in here, as there are in this little green dot. As many people in this white blue area as there are in this giant brown area. So the idea is that the Warren Supreme Court, using Reynolds v. Sims, gives more power to ethnic minorities, begins to really change the way society thinks of itself. The average person gets more protections, and it really changes the way people think about what's right and what's wrong for people that are accused of crimes and people that commit them, and people that want to keep their rights protected. We'll talk more about this in class tomorrow. Oh, and by the way, do me a favor. Miranda, put that on a piece of paper for me tomorrow. Shh, don't